I'm 83 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I was doing everything right. If you had looked at me from the outside, you would have said I was disciplined, responsible, dependable. I worked hard, I paid my bills, I showed up for my family. I didn't make reckless decisions. I didn't throw my life away. And that is exactly why it took me over 40 years to realize the mistake I was making. Because it didn't look like a mistake. It looked like maturity. It looked like stability. It looked like being a good man. Until one quiet afternoon, sitting in my car after work, I realized something that shook me more than any crisis ever had. I could predict the rest of my life. Not because I had a vision, but because I had stopped choosing. There were no dramatic collapses in my story. No bankruptcy. No scandal. No divorce. My life functioned. That's what made it dangerous. The mistake I repeated for decades was simple. I kept postponing what mattered most. I told myself I would slow down later. I would reconnect later. I would take risks later. I would ask deeper questions later. Later became my favorite word, and later quietly stole my years. If that word feels familiar to you, don't brush it off. Pay attention to it. I convinced myself that being busy meant being productive. I wore exhaustion like a badge of honor. I told myself that sacrifice was noble, but sacrifice without reflection turns into avoidance. I avoided uncomfortable conversations. I avoided asking whether I was truly happy. I avoided admitting that I felt disconnected from my own life. Instead, I doubled down on responsibility, because responsibility earns respect, but it does not guarantee fulfillment. There was a period in my 50s when everything looked stable. Good income, predictable routine, social respect. And inside, I felt restless. I ignored it. I told myself that restlessness was immaturity. I told myself that adults endure. Told myself that comfort was enough. It wasn't. The real danger is not failure. The real danger is building a life that works but does not feel like yours. That's what I did. I stopped listening to my instincts. I stopped questioning my patterns. I followed the script handed to me when I was young. Work hard, avoid risk, don't complain, be grateful. That script sounds wise. It can also become a cage. One day, I realized I had not updated my identity in decades. I was living according to goals I had set at 30, even though I was no longer that man. But I was afraid to pivot, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of looking unstable, afraid of admitting I had changed. So I stayed consistent in routines that no longer reflected who I was becoming. And consistency without awareness becomes stagnation. If you're listening and you've felt that quiet tension in your chest lately, I want you to ask yourself something honestly. Are you choosing your path, or are you maintaining it? There is a difference. Autopilot feels safe. You move, you accomplish, you produce, but you are not steering. You are maintaining momentum. And momentum can carry you far away from yourself. I remember the first time I felt truly invisible in my own life. It wasn't because people ignored me. It was because I had stopped expressing what I really wanted. I filtered myself. I became agreeable. I became predictable. And over time, predictability replaced authenticity. You can be respected and still feel unseen. You can be admired and still feel unfulfilled. You can succeed and still feel like you missed something essential. That realization hurt more than any external failure ever could. There was also the quiet cost of busyness. I filled my schedule so tightly that I never had to sit alone with my thoughts. Silence would have forced clarity, and clarity would have demanded change. So I stayed busy. Busy is socially rewarded, but busyness can be emotional avoidance. When I finally slowed down, I saw how many relationships I had maintained functionally, not deeply. I showed up physically, but not always emotionally. I assumed people would understand. They did not. Connection requires intention. And intention requires presence. If any part of this feels familiar, I encourage you to leave a comment and say, I needed this. Not for me, for yourself. Sometimes admitting it publicly makes it real. For decades, I confused motion with meaning. I thought progress meant growth. It doesn't. You can progress in salary and regress in self-awareness. You can accumulate achievements and lose alignment. And when you wake up in your 70s or 80s and realize that the person you became was shaped more by fear than by conviction, it is a heavy realization. Fear rarely announces itself clearly, that it disguises itself as practicality. I chose stability over courage because it seemed wise. I avoided difficult conversations because it seemed diplomatic, delayed change because it seemed strategic. But most of those decisions were fear-driven. And fear-driven decisions shrink your world slowly. The hardest truth I had to accept was this: I did not ruin my life. I diluted it. One compromise at a time, one postponed dream at a time, one avoided truth at a time. The mistake I repeated for decades was believing I had infinite time. Time is generous until it isn't. When you reach your 80s, you realize that the biggest regret is not what you failed at. It's what you never attempted. It's what you never expressed. It's who you never allowed yourself to become. That realization doesn't require a dramatic ending. It requires honesty. If you are younger than me, you have leverage. If you are my age, you still have agency. But only if you refuse to drift. I cannot go back and rewrite 40 years. I can speak honestly now. And if this resonates with you, consider subscribing and staying close to conversations like this. Not because I have all the answers, but because reflection changes direction. You do not need a crisis to change. You need awareness. The mistake I repeated for decades was postponing alignment. Don't postpone yours. Don't wait for a health scare. Don't wait for retirement. Don't wait for permission. Because one day you may wake up like I did and realize that the life you built is stable, respectable, and completely misaligned with who you are inside. And that is a quiet kind of loss. I am 83. I still have breath. I still have clarity. I still have choice. So I am choosing differently now. The question is not whether you will age. The question is whether you will arrive there aligned. If you take one thing from this, let it be this: later is not a strategy. It is a delay mechanism. Choose while you still can. Because decades pass quietly, and the life you repeat becomes the life you own.